Hello, welcome to Post Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and in this video I have combined my series of lectures on Michel Foucault's What is an Author. So those lectures are also available individually in 5 parts, but I thought if you want to watch them in one sitting, I should combine them in one video. So that's exactly what this is. I have not edited these much, but I hope you do enjoy watching these. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much. Today I'll briefly talk about Michel Foucault's very important 1969 essay called What is an Author? Now, I do teach this essay in my literary theory classes, but just recently someone in the comments had requested me to record a brief conversation on it, so I thought I should go ahead and do that. Now, the way I will do it is I will read some parts of the essay and then share my thoughts with you about the whole essay and also the reading itself. But please keep in mind that no amount of lecturing on this topic is going to make this comprehensible or exhaustively explicatory for you. What this essay will require and always will is that you should read it carefully with an idea about general oeuvre of Foucault himself. So reading is absolutely essential. Now I'll post a link to the full essay in the description. It is freely available online, and I do highly recommend that you should read the whole essay. And then if you watch this video, maybe this video will act as a supplement. Now, the first thing to keep in mind before we go into the essay itself is that it's a response essay, right? Foucault himself declares it. And the response is to the critiques of the book that he had recently published. And that is The Order of Things, right? And in The Order of Things, Foucault gives us the discursive history of 3 fields of what he would call scientific study, right? Economics, natural history, right? And finances and wealth, I think. And that will come across in my reading as well. And in the process of doing that, he had attributed certain thoughts or clusters of thoughts to certain proper names of the authors, right? He had grouped certain authors together. So the impression that the readers, of course the critical readers, got was that he had lumped these authors together and maybe he was suggesting that there is a correlation, right? Or that his reading of the authors or their intentions or their discursive production was not exhaustive enough because he had not covered them in that great detail. And that is where he starts, right? He immediately points to the critiques and what kind of critique was mobilized. So let's read it. Is an author. In proposing this slightly odd question, I'm conscious of the need for an explanation. To this day, the author remains an open question both with respect to its general function within discourse and in my own writings. That is, this question permits me to return to certain aspects of my own work which now appear ill-advised and misleading. In this regard, I wish to propose a necessary criticism and re-evaluation. For instance, my objective in The Order of Things had been to analyze verbal clusters as discursive layers which fall outside the familiar categories of a book, a work, or an author. But while I considered natural history, the analysis of wealth, and political economy in general terms, I neglected a similar analysis of the author and his works. It is perhaps due to this omission that I employed the names of authors throughout this book in a naive and often crude fashion. I spoke of Buffon, Cuvier, Ricardo, and others as well, but failed to realize that I had allowed their names to function ambiguously. this has proved an embarrassment to me in that my oversight has served to raise two pertinent objections. It was argued that I had not properly described Buffon or his work and that my handling of Marx was pitifully inadequate in terms of the totality of his thought. Although these objections were obviously justified, they ignored the task I had set myself. I had no intention of describing Buffon or Marx or of reproducing their statements or implicit meanings, but, simply stated, I wanted to locate the rules that formed a certain number of concepts and theoretical relationships in their works. In addition, it was argued that I had created monstrous families by bringing together names as disparate as Buffon and Linnaeus, or in placing Cuvier next to Darwin in defiance of the most readily observable family resemblances and natural ties. This objection also seems inappropriate since I had never tried to establish a genealogical table of exceptional individuals, nor was I concerned in forming an intellectual daguerreotype of the scholar or naturalist of the 17th and 18th century. In fact, I had no intention of forming any family, whether holy or perverse. On the contrary, I wanted to determine a much more modest task, the functional conditions of specific discursive practices. So as you heard me read, after he lays down the necessity for writing this paper and the two critiques that he had received, and where he corrects his critics that that is not what I had intended, he then goes on to articulate his vision of what needs to be done. And it's very clearly stated, right? What is the question of author in contemporary times, and then how is he going to tackle it or try to answer that question? Okay. Now keep in mind that all of this is in response to the critique of his own use of authorial figures in different discursive clusters in the order of things. And this essay, of course, is a response to that, but in the process of doing that, he is also theorizing the function of the author in a given discourse, and that is why this essay is extremely important for all of us who do literary studies, but also people who do historiography and who do research in social sciences. So let's read his declaration about the author and what is he proposing to do exactly in this particular paper. The question of the author demands a more direct response. Even now, when we study the history of a concept, a literary genre, or a branch of philosophy, these concerns assume a relatively weak and secondary position in relation to the solid and fundamental role of an author and his works. For the purposes of this paper, I will set aside a socio-historical analysis of the author as an individual and the numerous questions that deserve attention in this context. How the author was individualized in a culture such as ours, the status we have given the author, for instance, when we began our research into authenticity and attribution, the system of valorization in which he was included, or the moment when the stories of heroes gave way to an author's biography. The conditions that fostered the formulation of the fundamental critical category of the man and his work. For the time being, I wish to restrict myself to the singular relationship that holds between an author and a text, the manner in which a text apparently points to this figure who is outside and precedes it. Okay, so far here are some of the things that we are clear about. That this essay, What is an Author, is a response to the critiques that Foucault had received about the way he handled the subject of the author in the order of things. 2, he is trying to also tell us that the figure of the author is prominent in the Western tradition and is often invoked as a stable entity, and that needs to be studied. And then in the last paragraph that I read, he is basically saying there are many ways in which we could read the figure of the author and talk about it, social historic construction of the author and everything else, but he's saying, no, I am going to precisely just stay on one relationship, and that is the relationship between the author and a text, right? These two categories, and to try to explain as to how is it that a text that is in our hands already presupposes an author that exists outside of it, right? How does that relationship develop? And he says that is what I'm going to try to answer in this paper entitled What is an Author? So here we are. We'll continue reading a little more and talk a little more about the subject. Now, please keep in mind, I will be recording it in different sessions, so I might look different and the setup might look different, but one thing that will run through this entire conversation is that we'll be talking about Foucault's What is an Author? So I will now go on and read a little bit of where he tells us how writing itself has changed, right? These are some very dense and complex paragraphs. I'm not going to read all of them, but I'll pick up some major points that he makes, because that change in writing itself is what is crucial to his theorization of what is an author. So let's go and read a little more. Beckett supplies a direction. What matter who's speaking? Someone said. What matter who's speaking? In an indifference such as this, we must recognize one of the fundamental ethical principles of contemporary writing. It is not simply ethical because it characterizes our way of speaking and writing, but because it stands as an immanent rule, endlessly adopted and yet never fully applied. As a principle, it dominates writing as an ongoing practice and slights our customary attention to the finished product. For the sake of illustration, we need only consider two of its major themes. First, the writing of our day has freed itself from the necessity of expression. It only refers to itself, yet it is not restricted to the confines of interiority. On the contrary, we recognize it in its exterior deployment. This reversal transforms writing into an interplay of signs regulated less by the content it signifies than by the very nature of the signifier. Moreover, it implies an action that is always testing the limits of its regularity, transgressing and reversing an order that it accepts and manipulates. Writing unfolds like a game that inevitably moves beyond its own rules and finally leaves them behind. Thus, the essential basis of this writing is not the exalted emotions related to the act of composition or the insertion of a subject into language. Rather, it is primarily concerned with creating an opening where the writing subject endlessly disappears. The second theme is even more familiar. It is the kinship between writing and death. Okay, so the parts of the passages that I just read, and you can continue reading, what Foucault is trying to assert here is that the writing itself is different. And he starts with a quote from Beckett, which basically displays a sort of indifference to the writing itself, not writing itself, but who is saying what. Because the concern in modernism and postmodernism ought not to be what is authorial attention and what is being said. So that means that the composition act of writing that claimed to capture reality and represent it in the science is no longer feasible. It's not realistic fiction anymore. It's modernism, postmodernism. So what do the authors do in modernism? They are not writing about themselves. They are working with language, pushing it to its limit. I mean, Beckett, Joyce, Virginia Woolf, and others. So writing then becomes more about what language does, and within that then not what the words contain in themselves, but how the act of signification itself works, how reading is recursive, writing is recursive. All of those things bear upon the act of writing itself, and that's where these two themes emerge. One, that writing is no longer capturing something and representing it in science, but it's also about being recursive, right? About playing with language itself. And now that you will understand only if you understand Saussurean linguistics, right? And the differential nature of the sign and all that, and I have videos on that. The second part that I briefly touched upon, the second theme, is the connection of writing to death. Where is he going with that? So where he's going with that is he's pulling from two traditions, at least in this essay, that in the Greek tragedy, the hero died young so that he could be remembered in stories. I mean, think of Achilles, right? He agrees to die young if he could be remembered in the stories afterwards. So what writing captured was your death, but made you immortal. Similarly, when we read Alif Layla wal Layl, 1001 Nights, writing or the act of storytelling is about avoiding death, because for as long as she can continue a story, bring it to a climax, but not conclude it at the end of the night, she gets to live another day, right? But now what he's saying is another theme is that writing is no longer there to save the storyteller from symbolic and, in case of Sherazad, literal death, but that a new concept, a new way of looking at writing is emerged, and that is that the author dies at the moment he or she sends his work out in the world. Death of the author, right? So he's playing with what we already learned in Barth, right? Death of the author, that we are now within the province of the reader. The reader gets to decide what a text means, and the author's job is to efface his or her presence in the text, first by employing language as non-representational and non-compositional, and two, by constantly erasing his or herself in the process of writing, so that the signs on a page, the narrative itself, takes over its own form. So if we keep these two things in mind, what Foucault is then trying to teach us is that this is the nature of writing, or how writing is understood in our age. And in order to understand the role of the author, the function of the author, we first need to understand how writing is understood in our age, and his age is, he's writing in 1969. So that is all that I have to say in this conversation. I had planned to record it in one go, but I'm realizing that this needs, more deliberation and a slow progress through the essay. So I'm going to record it in different parts. So let us consider this part one, my beginning conversation on Foucault's What is an Author. I will soon be back with the next installment. Meanwhile, I do highly encourage you to read the essay and then, of course, contribute your thoughts and your questions as I'm recording. That way I don't have to respond in the comments. Maybe I can record a response. So I hope you're enjoying this journey, and I'll be back with the next installment of my discussion of death of what is an author. Thank you so much. I hope you're staying safe and taking care of each other. Please continue to do so, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, from me to you, peace and love. But if you recall in part 1, Foucault lays out his argument is that he needs to answer the question of the author. The reason he needs to answer it because his own work, The Order of Things, was criticized under 2 grounds, right? And I described that in the first part of the video. And then he goes on to say that there are 2 thematics under which we can discuss the state of writing. One is the writing itself has become too elusive, too much about the signifier, which is caught within a structure and not necessarily compositional, where you take something and represent it in a text, right? And 2, the second part of the thematic is that the writing today in his time is concerned with the death of the author. And by that he is referring to Barth, right? But what he says is that the author is no longer sought after or present in the text. The text and what it does, what the language does, has been accorded privilege. Now, because of this, he goes on to suggest that the author should have completely vanished from any kind of consideration. But it does not happen. And that is what he is trying to describe in this part that I'm going to discuss. What are the 2 things that are mobilized to erase the author, but that end up stabilizing the idea of the author, the name of the author, the function of the author, right? Now remember, he's trying to discuss what is an author, but this is Michel Foucault. He will build these little building blocks. Some of them will rely heavily on contemporary philosophical debates, and some of those are obvious digs at the people that he disagrees with. Keep that in mind. Another cautionary note is that none of these videos can ever teach you everything, okay? The most important part of this experience for you and me both is to read the text carefully, then read the footnotes, and then maybe watch this video and make up your mind. So I'll read a part of where his argument about these 2 themes that restrain the erasure of the author. I will read that part and then go on to discuss those 2 thematics in this part 2 of this series. Okay, so here we go. If we wish to know the writer in our day, it will be through the singularity of his absence and in his link to death, which has transformed him into a victim of his own writing. While all of this is familiar in philosophy, as in literary criticism, I am not certain that the consequences derived from the disappearance or death of the author have been fully explored, or that the importance of this event has been appreciated. To be specific, it seems to me that the themes destined to replace the privileged position accorded the author have merely served to arrest the possibility of genuine change. Of these, I will examine 2 that seem particularly important. So as we continue reading, we realize that the first constraint out of the 2 themes that he has chosen to discuss is our affiliations with the term work. Now remember, there is a reference here also to Barth's distinction between the work and a text, but by and large what he is suggesting is that the moment we invoke the term work, it presupposes an author, right? And then there are several questions that arise from it, right? Is there one singular author for a body of work collected together from someone? If we wanted to produce a definitive collected works of Nietzsche, what would we include in it? How would we make those decisions, right? Would all his footnotes be included in it? Would all his rough drafts would be included in it? All of these decisions presuppose an authorial figure, that is Nietzsche. Similarly, he says that even if you go back, right, to the times where the figure of the author was not necessarily connected to a body of work, well, some of those works are collected under the name of an author, right? So for as long as we invoke the term work, whether it be collected or an individual work, it already places us within a dynamic of an author or a figure that produced that work, right? So this is the first thing, this reliance on a certain loose definition and understanding of what he considers under theorized consideration of work itself or collected works itself precludes us from believing or acquiescing to this total death of the author or erasure of the author, because the figure of the author loosely is still connected to the question of the work, like complete works or just the work, the signifier work. That is the first theme that he talks about that precludes us or hinders us from taking our writing or our thinking to simply beyond the figure of the author. So keep that in mind. Okay, so the second practice that, according to Foucault in this essay, constrains us from believing in total erasure of the author and his or her connection to the work is reliance on a creature, right? So a creature, of course, this is a dig at Derrida, right? The idea of the écriture or arch trace or arch écriture in Derrida is in his argument when he's trying to suggest that writing precedes speech, right? What he's trying to say is that even before we speak, there is writing, right? And our thought is conceived in that primordial mode of writing itself, right? I'm simplifying Derrida's argument. But what Foucault is saying is, okay, if we buy into this concept of an a priori within which the language falls, a structure of writing within which speech falls, then all we are doing is, instead of attributing a work to an individual author, right, we are re-invoking the transcendental signifier, something outside of language, maybe God, maybe something spiritual that gives meaning to a text, to a work. So hence the author may not be an individual author, but the pre-existence of writing of this story outside of language, but which determines language itself, then keeps the figure of the author alive, but more importantly as a theological figure, right? So religion, or this belief in writing beyond writing, writing that precedes writing, the tyranny of the a priori, right? What exists before even I speak. So this is the second thing which should have erased the individual author, but it reinstates a larger than life, a transcendental authorial figure to whom or authorial structure to whom we attribute all acts of writing. So by associating an author to a work or collected works or whatever you want to call it, and by privileging a pre-structure that is like writing, that pre-exists speech, what he's saying is that both of these things were meant to eliminate the figure of the author, but they end up reinforcing the figure of the transcendental signifier, the author, God, or whatever you want to call it, or the work that must presuppose someone who wrote it. Right? These are the two thematics that he's saying are precluding us in his time to completely erase the figure of the author. So as we wade through his argument, what we are also learning is how Foucault builds his argument by referring to previous works, but by also defining and discussing the constituent parts of his argument. And that's something good to learn simply by reading this essay. So I'm going to stop here. This might sound really short, right? But since this is a dense essay, I will conclude today's discussion of the two thematics that he thinks hinder us from believing in the total erasure of the author, and then come back and read further into how he discusses the figure of the author, or the name of the author, or what he calls the author function. I hope this is useful to you. Let me know what you think, and as always, feel free to send me your suggestions. I love your comments. I cannot answer very complex questions in the comments, but if it is something that I can manage in the comments, I'll try to answer that. I hope you're all doing well and taking care of each other. I will now be back with the next part of this wonderful essay by Michel Foucault. Until then, take care, stay safe, and as always, peace and love. And today I'll continue my conversation about Michel Foucault's What is an Author? This is the third conversation on the same essay. Previously, we have covered how Foucault starts with objections to his own work. Then he gives us these two thematics that were supposed to eradicate the author but have not done so. And I covered that in part 2. And then he moves on to discussing the function of the author. And in today's part, that is the only part of the essay that I'll be covering. What does he mean by author function? How is he articulating that and moving on to discuss it? So in the very beginning of this part, as he moves from his discussion of the death of the author and the void created by it, this is what he declares. It is obviously insufficient to repeat empty slogans. The author has disappeared. God and man died a common death. Rather, we should re-examine the empty space left by the author's disappearance. We should attentively observe along its gaps and fault lines, its new demarcations, and the reapportionment of this void. We should await the fluid functions released by this disappearance. In this context, we can briefly consider the problems that arise in the use of an author's name. What is the name of an author? How does it function? Far from offering a solution, I will attempt to indicate some of the difficulties related to these questions. So, of course, that reference to the death of God is to that of Nietzsche, and the death of man or the author is to Barthes. But I think what Foucault is suggesting in this paragraph simply is that let us not worry about the debates whether or not the author is dead. Let us take it for granted. But the question is, even if we have declared the author dead and the work of art or writing has become non-representational of the authorial intention in so many ways, why is it that we still name the author, right? What constructs the name of the author? That is the more perplexing question. How do we believe in it? How do we come up with it? So that is what he is going to explore, the problematics of filling a void left by the death of the author, still by an authorial identity, and what constitutes it, right? And that's what he discusses in this part. So let us do a little bit longer reading of how he approaches that, and then go to how he concludes the question of the name of the author. The name of an author poses all the problems related to the category of the proper name. Here I am referring to the work of John Searle, among others. Obviously not a pure and simple reference. The proper name, and the author's name as well, has other than indicative functions. It is more than a gesture, a finger pointed at someone. It is, to a certain extent, the equivalent of a description. When we say Aristotle, we are using a word that means one or a series of definite descriptions of the type, the author of the Analytics, or the founder of ontology, and so forth. Furthermore, a proper name has other functions than that of signification. When we discover that Rimbaud has not written La Caisse Spirituelle, we cannot maintain that the meaning of the proper name or this author's name has been altered. The proper name and the name of an author oscillate between the poles of description and designation, and granting that they are linked to what they name, they are not totally determined either by their descriptive or designative functions. Yet, and it is here that the specific difficulties attending an author's name appear, the link between a proper name and the individual being named, and the link between an author's name and that which it names are not isomorphous and do not function in the same way. And these differences require clarification. To learn, for example, that Pierre Dupont does not have blue eyes, does not live in Paris, and is not a doctor, does not invalidate the fact that the name Pierre Dupont continues to refer to the same person. There has been no modification of the designation that links the name to the person. With the name of an author, however, the problems are far more complex. The disclosure that Shakespeare was not born in the house that tourists now visit would not modify the functioning of the author's name. But if it were proved that he had not written the sonnets that we attribute to him, this would constitute a significant change and affect the manner in which the author's name functions. Moreover, if we establish that Shakespeare wrote Bacon's Organon and that the same author was responsible for both the works of Shakespeare and those of Bacon, we would have introduced a third type of alteration which completely modifies the functioning of the author's name. Consequently, the name of an author is not precisely a proper name among others. These differences indicate that an author's name is not simply an element of speech as a subject, a complement, or an element that could be replaced by a pronoun or other parts of speech. Its presence is functional in that it serves as a means of classification. A name can group together a number of texts and thus differentiate them from others. A name also establishes different forms of relationships among texts. Neither Hermes nor Hippocrates existed in the sense that we can say Balzac existed, but the fact that a number of texts were attached to a single name implies that relationships of homogeneity, filiation, reciprocal explanation, authentication, or of common utilization were established among them. Finally, the author's name characterizes a particular manner of existence of discourse. Discourse that possesses an author's name is not to be immediately consumed and forgotten. Neither is it accorded the momentary attention given to ordinary, fleeting words. Rather, its status and its manner of reception are regulated by the culture in which it circulates. So this entire discussion about the question of the proper name and the authorial name, right, is really important. Because what he's trying to say is that naming, a proper name has two functions. Descriptive, Masood Raja, it describes me, a person who's like me. And designative, that what my role is. So when we are using a name connected to a work, the name of the author, we are designating that name as an author. Right? So he gives you an example. Now Pierre Dupont is the French version of John Doe. An unknown person, that we could associate a list of works to John Doe and then have in our mind that this person is the author of these texts, right? And it won't matter if that person has blue eyes, red eyes, or whatever, right? But at the same time, let's say we are reading Shakespeare and we find out, oh my God, he didn't live in the house that people think he lived in. His parents' name was different. It still won't matter to us because it might change the descriptive name of Shakespeare. But the designation of Shakespeare as the writer of these sonnets is still sustainable, right? Now that would come to crisis only, that designative naming of the author, if we were to go and prove that someone else wrote these sonnets. And people have claimed that, the anti-Stratfordians, right? Or someone else wrote the Homeric works. At that time, the proper name, even though it is still Shakespeare, will become problematic because it will no longer hold as the authorial name, right? So what is it hinting at? What it's hinting at is that the proper name might be stable, but the authorial name isn't necessarily stable because it is connected to the work that points to the author, or connected works, their affiliations, right? And it is that holds the name of the author stable. And that is why towards the end of this part of the essay, he will now take us outside the text, beyond the proper name, to the actual discursive practices of naming, right? To the author function itself, right? So most of what I've just read is pretty self-explanatory. I'm just like adding my little insertions here and there. But let's read the final part and then I'll come back and conclude it. We can conclude that unlike a proper name, which moves from the interior of a discourse to the real person outside who produced it, the name of the author remains at the contours of texts, separating one from the other, defining their form and characterizing their mode of existence. It points to the existence of certain groups of discourse and refers to the status of this discourse within a society and culture. The author's name is not a function of a man's civil status, nor is it fictional. It is situated in the breach among the discontinuities which gives rise to new groups of discourse in their singular mode of existence. Consequently, we can say that in our culture the name of an author is a variable that accompanies only certain texts to the exclusion of others. A private letter may have a signatory, but it does not have an author. A contract can have an underwriter, but not an author. And similarly, an anonymous poster attached to a wall may have a writer, but he cannot be an author. In this sense, the function of an author is to characterize the existence, circulation, and operation of certain discourses within a society. So here we are, after we read these brief passages that I just read, we have now figured out why he went into discussing the name of the author and the distinction between the proper name and the authorial name, or the name of the author. Because as his examples point out, the proper name within a discourse points to a person outside the discourse, right? This is Masood Raja. This is Michel Foucault. But the authorial name mediates between the text, its contours, and the discourse within which the text is produced, right? It's connected to it, but the text doesn't directly point to it, right? But we take someone as an author of a text within a social discourse. So it is the discursive practices of a given society that teach us to internalize this idea of the name of the author, right? That is what he's trying to highlight, because he will build his argument on that. So by the end of these paragraphs, one thing that has become very clear is that the author is not just a proper name. It's not someone designated. It's someone determined within a given culture through various discourses that determine or designate what the author function is, how to name an author. And that is what is crucial in understanding what is an author. And he will now move on to discuss some of these discourses, right? So keep this thing in mind. So as I pointed out in the previous conversations also, the best way to understand Foucault and Derrida and many other scholars is to read carefully line by line, because as they are arguing a point, they are also building, literally or figuratively, the building blocks of their argument. Each part of the argument seeps into the other. So that is why you have to read it carefully, chronologically, and then recursively to see how does he get there. How does he get from the proper name, the designation function and descriptive function, to the discursive production of the name of the author? And then he goes into discussing those discourses. So that's all I have today, very brief. And I haven't even done much of the explanation. I just wanted to give you chronologically the readings of certain specific passages and why does he discuss the things that he discusses in those. In today's section, I will just cover the 4 possible discourses or sub-discourses which, according to him, determine the name of the author. And he describes each one of them and discusses them and then gives us his conclusion. And after that, I think in the next video, I will be able to give you a concluding discussion of the final part of the essay. So keep that in mind. In this one, we'll be discussing the 4 facets or 4 different features of the discourse of naming the author that he talks about. And then I will conclude our today's conversation. But let me start with his conclusion to this section. This is what he says, which I will read, and then I'll go one by one over the 4 features of the discourse of the name of the author that he is talking about. So here we go. The author function is tied to the legal and institutional systems that circumscribe, determine, and articulate the realm of discourses. It does not operate in a uniform manner in all discourses at all times and in any given culture. It is not defined by the spontaneous attribution of a text to its creator, but through a series of precise and complex procedures. It does not refer purely and simply to an actual individual insofar as it simultaneously gives rise to a variety of egos and to a series of subjective positions that individuals of any class may come to occupy. So Foucault starts his discussion of the different features of the author function discourse, right? And he says there is like a limiting that he does, and I quote, "If we limit our remarks to only those books or texts with authors, we can also isolate 4 different features." Okay. What are those 4 different features? First, he says they are objects of appropriation, right? Both the texts that have an author, those are objects of appropriation. What does he mean by that? So that means that they have become property, okay? And if they have become property, then there are certain rules of attribution that apply to them. Okay, so if you understand the philosophy of property rights, like think of John Locke, right? In his work, the way he describes property rights is by suggesting that what I produced with the labor of my body and, of course, my intellect is not separate from me. It's an extension of myself, and hence I have a right to ownership, right? But what he's also suggesting here is that more than assigning a text as a property of an author, another reason for that was so that blame could be apportioned, so that speech acts or written acts could be attributed to a person and brought into the realm of law, right? And that was done within the world which he calls the bipolar world of sacred and profane. You wanted to know who wrote what because you wanted to distinguish as a religious authority whether it was sacred or profane, right? Because there were attendant ramifications of that. In so many parts of the world, those ramifications are still there. Think about it. If you live in a predominantly fundamentalist society of any religion, most of the times, if you want to make a transgressive statement, you don't want your name affiliated with it because, you could be punished for it. The same is the case over here. Bringing writing to the realm of law, right? That was the notion. What is blasphemous, what is not. So the moment Foucault says that the author is accepted into the social order of property, he was also posited within this old order, bipolar order of sanction and permission, right? So that's the problem. And in that sense, then, the authorial identity, historically, in Foucault's sense, the first feature of it is that it is connected to who owns it, but that ownership is not necessarily an autonomous ownership. That ownership is traced and authorized within a bipolar order of sacred and profane, right? So that those who say what they say, can be held accountable. And he says towards the end of 8th, 18th, and beginning of 19th century, that transgressive properties always intrinsic to the act of writing became the forceful imperative of literature. That literature started producing works that were transgressive. It is as if the author, at the moment he was accepted into the social order of property, was compensating for his new status by reviving the older bipolar field of discourse in a systematic practice of transgression, and by restoring the danger of writing, which on other side had been conferred the benefits of property, right? So that's the initial one facet of this discourse of writership, is that writing becomes property and hence it needs an owner. But the basic reason pre-19th and 18th century was to differentiate who has done what, who has said what blasphemous thing, right? But then, the moment writing becomes property of the author, the writers are also working with that bipolar order, because they are trying to transgress, they are trying to write things or say things that push against the very order that had been probably not dismantled but destabilized by giving the writers the right to owning their product, which is their writing. So that's the first thing that he keeps in mind. And then he goes on to the second variant or second aspect of writer function within a discourse that he thinks is necessary for us to understand. So let's go to that. So the second thing that Foucault points out is that the author function, and I'm quoting here, is not universal or constant in all discourse. What does he mean by that? So depending on if it is a scientific discourse, let's say the big distinction, or humanities, the function of the author would be completely different, or what is expected of the author would be completely different. So he gives an example that there was a time we didn't worry much about the author of folk tales and short stories. We just accepted them as valid and respect-worthy stories of our times. We never really located or tried to locate the author. Whereas at a certain time in the history of scientific discourse, it was important to know who has stated what and how, who is the scientist behind this idea, who is the scientist behind this idea. But then there is a kind of a reversal. Science, after as a discourse, as it has established its procedures, so the only time we attribute something to an author or a scientist is if it's a theorem, Pythagorean theorem, this or that. Most of the times, since scientific discourse presupposes that there is a universal way of doing things, there are certain postulates that everyone agrees to. So the name of the author, the name of the scientist falls by the wayside, and the process itself takes precedence. So within the scientific discourse, then, math and others, we don't really go looking for an author. But since writing entered sanction, entered law, we constantly look for the author. First, we looked for it for authorial reasons. If you lived in Renaissance England and you wanted to stage a play, you had to list the author and who wrote the play, right? Because it had to be approved by the master of revels. and there was censorship. So authorship was necessary. But even more so, in the current literary discussions, right, there were strategies developed to seek the authorial intention, right, all the phenomenological readings. He gives us the examples of Saint Jerome, right, how simply by assigning one name to an author is not, to a text is not enough. You can look at a text or at a work and find 3 or 4 different things to look at to know whether or not this work can be attributed to this author. And you can read those 4 ways of looking at it. So in literary discourse, then, increasingly the question of the author, right, becomes prominent, right, and it becomes crucial to name the author, right? And a lot of the literary approaches to criticism then become these approaches which either want to give us a quintessential final text of an author, or even if you go by intersectionality, right, you're trying to locate Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children, which other authors has he incorporated in his writings. So, depending on which discourse you are in, the prominence or significance of the author shifts. So there is no stable expected author function. And that is the second point which in his view complicates the idea of the name of the author. Okay, let's go to his third discussion of the third thing that complicates the question of the author. So Foucault's third explanation of how the author function functions, and his third point is, and I quote, "It is not formed spontaneously through the simple attribution of a discourse to an individual." So you can't say, here is a scientific discourse, this is the scientist, right? Each discourse has a methodology, which designates the author. Right? You first have to understand what constitutes a good poem, what constitutes poetry, and then assign it. So there is this correspondence between expectations of a text and its authorial identity. And he says, for example, in literary criticism, he says, for example, the traditional methods for defining an author or for determining the configuration of the author from existing texts derive in large from those used in the Christian tradition. And this is where he goes to discuss Saint Jerome and the 4 ways that he discusses. But even in the contemporary literary tradition, what he's talking about is that author is seen as a principle of unity. If you're a new critic or if you're a formalist, how you employ language, a current postmodern sense, intertextuality. But that idea of attributing an author to a body of work or to certain works is not automatically assigned. It has a method behind it, right? And knowing that method is what constructs the author function for the authors in any given time. So here he says, finally, the author is a particular source of expression who in more or less finished forms is manifested equally well and with similar validity in a text, in letters, fragments, drafts, and so forth. So we're looking for a consistency. If we say these are works of Faulkner, we will then develop a certain understanding of what constitutes a Faulkner's work, right? And then trace them back to the author. As I mentioned earlier, another way of attributing works to the author was when we did the phenomenological criticism, where we saw the text or a poem as arrived intention of the author, and then by using how the author uses these words, those words, these vocabularies, we can then develop kind of a research that points to a certain author. I mean, those of you who are familiar with textual scholarship, people who read about, oh, this is the definitive work on Shakespeare, a lot of time people go back to the text and point out certain things that the author might have used in another text, and those similarities then kind of become a way of pointing to the authorial figure behind a text, behind a work. And that changes according to how we do the attribution to the author, right? And I'm going to continue going on to his fourth point. The fourth point is very complicated, but all he is saying is that even if you go by speech act theory or by language theory, you already know that there are different things at play in the text. First is the simple distinction of author versus the narrator. We usually don't conflate the two, right? Then there are different egos at play. The composer, the ego of the author, then the ego of the person being represented in the story. We look at it from their point of view, right? And then at some point, the performative ego of the world or the characters that are present in a given moment in a text. Similarly, for scientific discourse, he is talking about the authorial identity will shift depending on what has been accomplished, who has repeated which scientific process, right? Or what are the possible futures based on this knowledge, right? So at any given time, it's not just the authorial ego at play, but depending on what kind of linguistic shifters are used, the eyes, which eye are we reading, all of that have a bearing on attributing a text to an author. So these in a nutshell are then four things that Foucault talks about what complicates the whole idea of the name of the author itself. So what we have learned so far is that the name of the author, of course, is discursively produced, but even that doesn't stabilize it. It has been historically understood differently. And that in literary studies we read it differently. The historians read it differently. The scientists read it differently. Where he is going with that, of course, is to point out that when I use the authorial names in the order of things, this is what is at play when you charge me of using them naively or not necessarily giving you enough information, because name of the author is not just a simple statement. It's produced discursively and it's complicated, and in order to really challenge me, Foucault's assertions about jumping together or bringing together different authors, this is the complexity that you need to understand. So I'm going to end this section here. It's probably not as exhaustive or as explanatory as you might have expected. So please feel free to send your questions to me, and I'll try to answer them. And I will come back and then conclude this whole essay in one final snippet of my conversation about it. But as I always suggest, there is no substitute to careful reading of a text. So these videos are kind of a supplement. Not even a supplement, they're just a small little aid. The most that you will understand is by actually carefully reading the essay itself and then maybe watching these videos. That's all. Thank you so much. Please stay safe, take care of each other, and I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love. Hello, welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm here today to conclude my conversation on Michel Foucault's What is an Author? And this is part 5 of my conversation on the topic. So before we go into the details of the last part of the essay, in the beginning of this part, Foucault has already concluded 4 different ways a discourse can work, how the author function can shift depending on what discourse, what discipline, what time frame it is in. And then he gives us his concluding thoughts, which I had already mentioned in the previous video. But then he introduces sort of a new, nuanced thought on it. And that is when he says Homer, Aristotle, and the church fathered played a transdiscursive role, right? Because he says, okay, we can understand the role of the author as I've just discussed, but then there are always certain people in history who are not just determined by one particular discourse of the author function, right? And what he's suggesting is that this type of author is surely as old as our civilization. But I believe that the 19th century in Europe produced a singular type of author who should not be confused with great literary authors or the authors of canonical religious texts and the founders of the sciences. Somewhat arbitrarily, we might call them initiators of discursive practices. So, where is he going with that? What he's going to do with it is to go back to his beginning, right? By saying, when I mention Marx or Ricardo or Gibbon, I am not necessarily just relying on the limited author function of them, but rather I'm counting them as certain figures who are transdiscursive. What does transdiscursive literally mean? That they can transcend discourses, and that they can also be initiator of discourses. So the important thing to keep in mind is to understand discourse itself, right? Individual doesn't initiate it, but the body of knowledge which he or she produces, which gets perpetuated, disseminated, adopted, rewritten, reread, that is what becomes part of a huge discourse of knowledge. And within that, there are certain people who are enunciating subjects according to Foucault, and these are the ones who have the knowledge and the institutional prestige to make statements, right? But he's saying there are certain authors who are more than just the proper name, more than just the author function, and for them he is coining, in a way, a new term, which is initiators of discursive practices, right? So let's talk a little more about this, and this is also the concluding part of Foucault's essay and the concluding part of my conversation of this essay, What is an Author? So Foucault then goes on to further distinguish these initiators of discourses, right? And here is how he talks about this. And I'm quoting, "In this sense, their role differs entirely from that of a novelist, for example, who is basically never more than the author of his own text. How? Freud is not simply the author of the interpretation of dreams, or wit and its relation to the unconscious, and Marx is not simply the author of the Communist Manifesto or Capital. They both establish the endless possibility of discourse." And then he says that an obvious answer to that could be, okay, Anne Radcliffe is a novelist. She wrote The Mysteries of Udolpho, and then so many other people also wrote mysteries relying on the tropes that she uses. And his answer to that is that to some extent, maybe. But another important thing that these initiators of discourses do is they don't produce just analogous works, right? It's not Freud defined the libido and everyone else started using it. They also bring about the possibility of differences. Because anyone who rereads Freud, let's say Melanie Klein, they are still working within psychoanalysis, the discourse of psychoanalysis. So an initiator of discourse then produces a body of knowledge and a discourse which people can then use to further develop and understand things, but also people can then bring about their differences of opinion, but they will be working within the same discourse, right? That is the distinction that he's making between Marx and Freud and just another novelist and another author. And that's an important thing to keep in mind. So in the next part, he makes another distinction. And that distinction is between the founding acts of a science or a founding principle of a science, theorized or determined by a scientist, and the initiators of discourse. So what he's suggesting is that the founding act, let's say what he's saying is, in the scientific program, the founding act is on equal footing with its future transformations. It is merely one among the many modifications that it makes possible. Sometimes it just becomes a reference, right? But it doesn't unleash a discursive practice where differences and dispersions and everything else are recorded and talked about, right? In other words, the founding act of a science can always be rechanneled through the machinery of transformations it has instituted. On the other hand, the initiation of a discursive practice is heterogeneous to its ulterior transformations. To extend psychoanalytical practice as initiated by Freud is not to presume a formal generality that was not claimed at the outset. It is to explore a number of possible applications, right? So when you use a founding principle of science, you are taking that as stable, right? And then looking at what it makes possible. But when you are dealing with an initiated discourse, you're not taking that as the beginning point. You might even take that and see what else does it make possible. So if you look at Freud, we start with psychoanalysis and his diagram of the psyche, but then when we go to Melanie Klein, we go to Lacan, and if you look at now even people like Althusser, Franco Berardi, they bring Marxism to bear upon it, and that's why there are too many dispersions in it within the discourse of psychoanalysis. And that's the distinction he's making. And he says the initiation of a discursive practice, unlike the founding of a science, overshadows and is necessarily detached from its later developments and transformations. So psychoanalysis in the 21st century may have nothing to do with what Freud had previously said. But if you go to the scientific founding principles, you probably will take them as stable unless there has been a huge shift in science itself, right? And that is what he's talking about. So stated schematically, the work of these initiators is not situation in relation to a science or in the space it defines. Rather, it is science or discursive practice that relate to their work as the primary points of reference, but not as the over-determining primary point of reference, right? As something that they build on, that they challenge, that they even re-articulate. So, I mean, this is he going towards the conclusion of the essay, right? And that is where we are headed now in this final part of my conversation on it. So let's go and see what his concluding thoughts are. Then towards the end of the essay, as Foucault is concluding, right, he is further telling us that, look, this scientific discourse or the founding of scientific principles and philosophy and others, the distinction that I'm using is fairly arbitrary, right? What he's saying is that the point I'm trying to make is that if you go back and find a mistake in what Galileo suggested, you can't come back and rewrite the history of astronomy because other things have already altered it. But if Freud said something or said something that was not recovered, there are always returns in any discourse, and the returns always are journeys back to the initiators of a discourse. And then if you can repackage it, unpack something that they said, right, and bring it back, you change that discourse. Just like if you find something in Marx's writing that contradicts what we have believed about Marx, that practice, that return to those origins is part of this discursive practice that he's talking about, right? And then he goes on to suggest that, look, there are not many things positive in this essay, and that we all also struggle with the question of the subject. Who is the authorial subject, right? So what he's saying is that instead of trying to retrieve an autonomous subject of science or even of discourse, we should suspend that question. What does he say? We should suspend the typical question, how does a free subject penetrate the density of things and endow them with meaning? This is our idea of a centered human subject capable of agency. How does it accomplish its design by animating the rules of discourse from within? Rather, he says, we should ask, under what conditions and through what forms can an entity like the subject appear in the order of discourse? What position does it occupy? What functions does it exhibit? And what rules does it follow in each type of discourse? In short, the subject must be stripped of its creative role and analyzed as a complex and variable function of discourse. Now, why is he suggesting that? Because if the author is determined or overdetermined in so many ways by a discourse, and if within the authors there are some who are initiators of discourse, so the idea is we cannot imagine a centered author figure attached to a text. We have already assumed that that's an author function. Similarly, the question of the subject can also be made into a question where we don't rely on a stable human subject, but place that human subject within the discourse within which he or she is produced and functions, right? And so hence he reaches his conclusion that the author, or what I have called the author function, is undoubtedly only one of the possible specifications of the subject. And considering past historical transformation, it appears that the form, the complexity, and even the existence of this function are far from immutable. We can easily imagine a culture where discourse would circulate without any need for an author. Discourses, whatever their status, form, or value, and regardless of our manner of handling them, would unfold in a pervasive anonymity. No longer the tiresome repetitions, who is the real author. So here we are, at the end of a very important but a slightly complex essay, right? We started with Foucault's assertion that he has been indicted for using the authorial names wrongly in the order of things. And then he goes on to explain the reason he used them. And then he says, well, here is how I think of the author. He gives us the two discourses that have tried to eliminate the figure of the author but have reinstated it, right? The presence of écriture and death of the author. Then he gives us four different things that happen in any given discourse that stabilize or constitute the figure of the author, the name of the author itself. Then he is giving us a comparison of how a philosophical discourse is different from scientific discourse, and how in any given discourse, philosophy, economics, there are certain people who are just more than the author function, and those are the initiators of discourse. And that rereading of these figures is always a return to what they had said and re-articulating it, finding something that had been silenced, that had been not accounted for, which then transforms the whole discourse. And then also guiding us to realize that we need not to think of a stable, centered human subject, but also put the question of the subject under erasure, in a sense, under erasure that subject we should try to study how is it produced, which discourse constitutes it, how does that subject do certain things. And then the hope, he says, is that there might come a moment where we may not even look for the authors, where a discourse goes and runs around anonymously, and we act upon it. Think of it, we are in that kind of a world. There are so many conspiracy theories, but also belief systems that do not ask for an author. If I tell you that wealth would eventually trickle down, if more people could keep the money that they have and didn't pay in taxes, they will create more jobs, and hence wealth will trickle down. You're not going to ask me who said that. Yeah, maybe in a scientific paper I'll have to cite my sources, but for so many people that is a discourse that they are part of, that they believe in, and they never ask who said that, right? Because the discourse of neoliberalism in so many ways no longer needs an author that we can point to, that Milton Friedman says so, so and so says so, right? And that is what he's talking about. So overall, this is my take on this highly complex essay. I hope it has been useful to you. And if you have any other questions about particular parts of the text, please post them in the comments and I'll try to answer them. But as I said in the other videos in this series, none of this will be helpful to you if you don't read the text itself carefully and go through it line by line, page by page, because one key to understanding such complex essays is to read them really carefully. And then if you feel like it, you can use these videos as an aid. But these videos in themselves will never be able to explain to you what is an author in its richness and complexity. That's all. Thank you so much. Stay safe. Please take care of each other, and I will now see you next time. Until then, as always, peace and love. So that's it. A compilation of my shorter lectures on Michel Foucault's What is an Author. As always, I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have, and do take a few moments to let me know what you think of this compilation or of the individual lectures. Thank you so much, and as always, peace and love.